This is a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast.
Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. And today we're speaking with local guide and author Lisa Herbert, who runs the cemetery tours Toowoomba, Drayton and Darling Downs. And Lisa is a qualified person in lots and lots of areas. And I think if I had more than an hour, I probably wouldn't have enough time to cover the things that she does. But what I really want to talk to you today, Lisa, is about your cemetery tours and about death. Welcome.
Wow, we have some fun today. But it's such a really important topic to obviously bring up because so many people put their heads in the sand about it and we can't avoid it. It's coming for us all.
Now, you once said, I read that you said you can tell a lot about a town from its cemetery. What did you mean by that?
There's the obvious things like you can look for nationalities, for example, to give you an idea of the makeup of the town. So for Toowoomba, you'll walk through Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery and you will see amazing symbolism representing the Irish, so lots of those Celtic crosses. You'll also see shamrocks moulded into the sandstone, so obviously a lot of Scottish pioneers here. You'll also see an amazing number of German names because our German history is fascinating as well. So already just by seeing those nationalities, a new word here, you can get a sense of what our makeup was in the 1800s, the Scottish, the Irish, the Germans.
You say that your tours, you can examine hardships and triumphs and tragedies, ingenuity and innovation. Give me an example of each of those things. It's hardships and hangings. Can we start with those?
Well, in the 1860s, Toowoomba hanged 4 men. So we had the Toowoomba jail just off Margaret Street, and in fact where the gallows was where the swimming pool is, just near as part of a very popular hotel here. So 4 people were hanged here, but we don't know where they're buried in the cemetery. We know they're in the cemetery somewhere, but back in those days, criminals were not afforded the respect of having a name or a location. So with those hangings, quite extraordinarily, they weren't public, but if people could climb the trees and the surrounding buildings, they could glimpse over the low walls of the jail and get a glimpse of what was happening. And back in those days, how it unfolded is at 8 o'clock, the governor of the jail would go and collect the person to be hanged. They would then walk together. The governor would hand the person over to the sheriff who was responsible for undertaking the hanging. The hangmen were brought from Brisbane. So that would have happened from 8 o'clock in the morning. And then once the person was hanged, they were left to hang for 20 minutes to ensure that they were dead. Once they were ensured they were dead, they were cut down and placed in a shell at the bottom of the gallows and promptly moved to the cemetery where a grave had been pre-dug. So most of the people in the pioneering section of the cemetery were dead one day, buried the next. But these people that were hanged, these men that were hanged, were pretty much buried within hours. So they were buried warm.
Wow.
And we don't know where they are. There's those 4 men are 4 of thousands, several thousands of unmarked graves within the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery.
Yeah. What about an example of triumph and tragedy? Who do you take people's graves? Which graves do you take them to if you're going to talk about a triumph?
Oh, just the extraordinary efforts that our pioneers took to make a go of it here in Australia. I go past the Emerson grave, and the Emersons were pioneers. They emigrated from England with their sons, and back then they were allocated land, but they didn't know what land they were getting. You know, there wasn't Facebook, they didn't have email, they couldn't, you know, the real estate agent couldn't send them photos. But extraordinarily, they just rocked up, and the land they got was at Crow's Nest. So it was undulating, hilly country, hills and valleys, highly forested with massive hoop pines. And John Emerson was a miner. He didn't know anything about clearing land or farming in Australia. So he and his sons set about clearing that land by hand. So this was in the kind of late 1880s, 90s. So crosscut saws, shovels, picks, mattocks, no tractors, no money for bullocks. So they would have done that by hand for years. Eventually, they were able to clear some land. But you can imagine once they've cleared land and trying to grow crops, for example, they planted maize and pumpkins and melons using a neighbour's borrowed horses. But you can imagine the wildlife that would have gone, this is tasty. We haven't had maize before. So out of the surrounding rainforest were wallabies and pademelons and red kangaroos and bandicoots and possums, all wanting a feed. So this family had to work out a way to control all these animals, and they did that through various traps. Thankfully, they were able to have some sort of an early income because the Shire and the government had a bounty on these wallabies and the pademelons, and the pelts, the skins were worth something too. So eventually, they kind of got some control over what they were growing, but as you can imagine, the maize started to fruit, and that's when the crows and the cockatoos came in. So the fact that they were able to make a go of it eventually is an absolute triumph. I couldn't imagine rocking up in a foreign country, not knowing what to expect, looking at massive hoop pine trees, working out how to cut them down, and then trying to cultivate it. Extraordinary, extraordinary.
So what about murder and mischief? Have you got a couple of stories of those, I would imagine? And also, Lisa, while you're thinking about that, do you find the history of these graves, and is that why you particularly go to these ones and tell the story because it's a good story? Or how do you work out where you're going to go on your cemetery tours?
I find a grave that just piques my interest. And that's something that there have been graves that have been very well documented in the cemetery before because, Groom, all these people who are big names in our community. But it's like, just because they were politicians and rich doesn't mean that their contribution was any greater to people like John Emerson who cleared all that land. So I just find graves that pique my interest, and then I go down a rabbit warren, and many a Saturday night has been spent till 6 a.m. the next morning going down rabbit holes. And this was one of them, Dear Margaret Curtis. The headline in the paper when she died as a 28-year-old mother of two was the Ruthven Street murder. And I really like this story. I mean, it's a horrible story of murder, but it also shows you a microeconomy that was working within this community at the time. For example, Margaret had been into town. She'd sold her butter to Mr. Phillips, who was the local storekeeper. So immediately I start thinking, I wonder if she had a cow, or maybe she gathered milk from other people around Toowoomba who had cows to make the butter. So she got some groceries from Mr. Phillips. Who knows whether she purchased them or bartered them for the milk. So she bought a pound of tea, 4 pounds of sugar and some starch. She also called in at the chemist and bought a bag of sweeties for her little boy. At home, she had a toddler, and she also had a baby that was just shy of 3 weeks old. And on her way home, she was grabbed from behind, and it was reported that she was brutally murdered in the main street of the town. A packet of starch had been broken in the struggle, and its contents marked the place where the woman had been seized. And then following that, in the paper, the articles surrounding her murder was so much detail, and it goes to show you how graphic the media reporting was at the time. They went deep down into her injuries, and I won't go into it now because you will get complaints. But it was very commonplace to report what was said in court, and every gruesome detail was said in court. At least 3 men I've been able to find were tried for her murder, all found not guilty. One wasn't even in town at that particular time. From what I can work out, there were only 2 police in Toowoomba at the time. So this was in the 1865. So Toowoomba was still probably less than a couple of thousand people just to have 2 police officers. So obviously justice was quite difficult in those days, and even a £100 reward raised by locals couldn't find the murderer, and £100 in 1865 was massive money. So who killed Margaret Curtis? Nobody knows. And sadly, Margaret grave is in the Church of England section, and in her grave is that little baby, that little 3-week-old baby. He died several months after her death. So I don't know why, but I just think of the grief that her husband would have been facing, not only his 28-year-old bride, but also their baby died 6 months of age. So that particular grave tells us about a murder, about justice, the lack of policing, and also the microeconomy. So just by going down a rabbit warren, we've learnt something about our history.
Now tell me what sort of people come on your tours and how often do you do your tours?
I'm doing them about once a month. I'm still treading the waters about finding and trying to get the word out. Starting a small business it can be quite difficult, but I'm finding a whole range of people, probably the more mature people, probably 50 plus, who are interested in our history. But I've had several teenagers bugging their parents and say, hey, can we go on this? So it really is a broad spectrum of people who want to go on these tours, and it's wonderful when you get the young people in, because they're so willing to just soak it all in. And it's great that if you can get them comfortable with mortality and death and cemeteries while they're teenagers, well, they're going to be much better versed to deal with it in later years.
Well, I want to talk to you about that, because that is one of your passions, isn't it? It's about people thinking about how they're going to die and what they want to happen after they die. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'll just remind the listeners that they're on 102.7 FM. They're listening to Big Little Small Talk, and we're talking to Lisa Herbert, who is a local guide and author, and she takes people through the cemetery. Now, I was thinking when you were talking about your group tours that would be a great thing for a family to do. Do families want to come and sort of hear about their heritage specifically, or I thought it'd be a great thing to do on a Mother's Day.
I thought so too. It's funny. I get private tours, so people come and just book a private tour, and they're fantastic because you can show them the crux of the normal tour, but then they will see something that sparks their interest. So we all go through a tangent and we talk about symbolism things. When families do my tour, they do it because they want it personalised. They want to have an experience between them. So they're not only looking at the cemetery graves, they're also looking at those graves as a family and having discussions about the community that they have grown up in or moved into. So yeah, families, lots of 2 kids, 2 adults, very common.
And what are your special tours that you do during Carnival of Flowers? What do they involve?
I'm so excited. Oh, goodness me. So this is the first time this has ever been offered in the Toowoomba Carnival of Flowers, and they're called cemetery tours.
Oh, I like it. Cute.
Because the vegetation, there are some stands of trees in that cemetery of regional significance, and it's really cool. We don't picture the cemetery as being a wonderful place to visit, but we really should. And also on these cemetery tours, I'm going to talk about the symbolism that is on the headstones. There are so many flowers and vegetation that are on headstones that have a meaning. For example, if you see ivy on a headstone, that means fidelity and affection. So usually when you see ivy on a memorial or a headstone, it means it's highly likely that there's 2 in the grave, most likely a husband and a wife, for example. And there's so much you can tell without even reading the words on the ledger, which is where the name and information is. That's called a ledger. So you don't have to look at the ledger and the information. You can look at all the pretty things, all the amazing symbolism. So yeah, the cemetery tours, running most days, probably every day during the Carnival of Flowers. And I'm also doing a fundraising walk called the Graveyards. Get it? Yards? Yeah, walking, exercise.
Obscure. Okay, keep going.
So yeah, a couple of times a week.
Maybe another catchier name might be.
Come on. No, it's a walking group. So, I should have used the whole name, Graveyards Walking Group.
Okay.
That's the official name. And that's going to be a fundraiser. So while the focus is just getting out in our beautiful Toowoomba spring air, just walking around a cemetery, and I'll point out a few things as we do the walk. So I would imagine we'll probably get to do about 3K around the cemetery with me pointing out a few things. So I'm really excited about the Graveyards walking group.
I love it. I love it. We just have to work on that name, I'm sure. You were talking about the symbolism there. I read somewhere about the seashells, how often there's seashells on people's graves. Can you talk about that and what that might symbolise in terms of the nationality of those graves?
Yeah, various symbols and various meanings. I know, for example, I've spent a lot of time in the Dampier Peninsula on the top of WA, where the Indigenous people are saltwater people. So it makes sense that their incredible cemetery at Lombardina is just all seashells. Every grave is totally covered with seashells because they're seawater people. More so in Anglo-Saxon, the shell can often represent the body or the thing protecting the soft shell, the soft soul within. So that's another representation of seashells on graves. Interestingly enough, there's not a lot of seashells in the Toowoomba and Drayton Cemetery. And I don't know why that is. Right. It's fascinating.
I thought that I had read that it was it could be particularly Greek people that have the seashells. I don't know where I went down that rabbit hole from.
Well, this is the thing. Symbolism doesn't have to have a consistent meaning. A butterfly, if we leave the studio today, I see a butterfly and I think of a friend. You might think of a child who once ran after a butterfly. So what we see means different things to different people. And there's some wonderful symbolism within that cemetery that no one else would understand, but it means something to the family.
Lisa, just talk to us briefly about how cemeteries are divided by the Catholics and the Protestants. And has that always been the case, and is that still the case?
Divided in life and in death. So we are segregated in life and we're segregated in death, very much so. When the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery first kind of was proclaimed back in the 1850s, each religion was given its own amount of land to manage. So the Catholics were given 2 acres, Church of England was given 2 acres, the pagans were given half an acre, and it was up to that religion to look after their patch. But not all the religions were good at doing that, and there were regular complaints to the Toowoomba Chronicle advertiser back in the day of livestock wandering over those sections. So eventually a trust was formed, and every person on that trust represented one of the 7 religions. So yes, in those days, in the 1800s and probably the early 1900s, religious symbolism and religious segregation was very, very important. There are unmarked graves, for example, of babies within that cemetery in the public section who, when they died, they wouldn't have been baptised or christened. Therefore, they could not be laid to rest in the religion of their mother, which is awfully sad. So that's why there's a lot of babies in the public section.
Oh, is that right?
So yeah, an awful segregation back in those days. These days, so much cemeteries, I guess people aren't as religious as they were, so the religious symbolism isn't that important. There certainly are, and you still can buy your grave in the allocated religion of your choice. Absolutely, there are cemeteries that still do that. However, for example, if you go to the newer section of the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery, where, for example, people would have been buried today, there is not that religious segregation. But if you wanted there to be, you could.
Right. And is there still room to be buried? And is the rate of people being buried just declining markedly because of people being cremated?
Yeah, very much so. So at the moment, about 2/3 of people who die within Australia, about 180,000 people every year in Australia die, and 2/3 of those will be cremated. In some areas, that would be climbed to 3/4, and that's probably for availability reasons. So if you've got lots of crematoria options around you, you're more likely to be cremated. However, if you lived in Western Queensland or Western New South Wales, where you actually have to be travelled hundreds of kilometres to find the nearest crematorium, you're more likely to be buried. But overwhelmingly, cremations are the most popular, considered the most cost-effective and the easiest.
And what about Sikhs or Muslims, or what's happening there with the graves?
Toowoomba is really important for the Muslim community. The cemetery, the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery, is the furthest west cemetery in Queensland that allows the burial of Muslims. So when you're in the cemetery, you'll see that most of the graves lie east to west, or the later graves west to east. However, at the back of the cemetery, in the Muslim section, they're facing pretty much north-south, going the other way, and that is, of course, so that when they're lying down, they would be facing Mecca. There's also different ways that they are actually buried itself. So they're shrouded, they're not in a coffin. They're also not covered in dirt, and by that reason, the dirt doesn't touch the body. So what they will do, most likely, they will put planks of wood over the body first and then put the soil on, so the soil doesn't rest on the body itself.
So interesting. And just before we leave this topic, or this part of this discussion, what about Indigenous graves or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander graves? Many of those here in the cemetery in Toowoomba?
I mentioned before about the unmarked graves. There are many unmarked graves of Indigenous Australians within the cemetery. It was only in 1911 that local Indigenous people were given the respect of having a name. Before that time, they would have been buried as, and there are several of them, Aboriginal Billy, Aboriginal Ada, and that was the only names that they were given.
Wow.
Well, the word Aboriginal and then a name.
Right.
So whether it be Aidan or Billy, Mary, there was a handful of them, but Billy was certainly very common. But yeah, so for decades they were buried in the cemetery without their names.
Yeah, it's tragic, isn't it? You're on Big Little Small Talk. You've tuned in. We're talking to Lisa Herbert, who's a local guide and author. And Lisa, I want to talk to you about a teenage girl reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. What was going on there?
So Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a world-renowned psychiatrist who was making waves in the 60s and 70s. Back in those days, the emotional needs of the dying had never been given any time by the medical profession. You know, they were put in the back of the hospital. They weren't spoken to about their illness. They were just, you know, they languished almost because they had a terminal illness or were close to dying. But Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wanted to hear what they had to say. And so in the 60s and 70s, as a psychiatrist, she started interviewing dying people. And no one had ever done that before. Not only did she speak to the adults, she also spoke to children. So she wrote a series of books. And the first one, On Death and Dying, was the first one I read. I was 14. My mother had these books in her book cabinet, and I'd run out of stuff one holidays to start reading. So I started going down the rabbit hole of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I think I read 6 of her books as a 14-year-old, and they really influenced me. I couldn't understand why no one had spoken to these dying people and told them that they were dying and what they would expect or should expect. It was just hard to fathom. So at that point, as a 14-year-old, Western society's perception of death and dying kind of slapped me in the face like a wet fish.
So was she the first one to sort of document all those stages of, grieving, anger, and what are the stages? Yeah.
Don't know. I can't remember them. But this is the thing. Death and grief are quite different. I'm all about death, and she was a lot about grieving. I know it was denial, anger, acceptance. Yeah. And she's also been massively misquoted in those stages of grief. But yeah, her influence was profound on the profession. Interestingly, she had a terminal illness. So she knew she was dying as well. So she wrote another book while she was dying.
Right.
Yeah.
Why did your mother have those books, do you think?
Yeah, good question. My grandfather, who I never got to meet, he had terminal cancer, but he was, in his spare time or when he couldn't work anymore, he was an artist. So he would paint watercolour paintings. And he got to the stage where he was finishing off or trying to finish a painting, and he turned to my mother and said, "Gee, it's too bad that I'm not going to finish this painting." And my mother missed the opportunity to say, "Yeah, unfortunately, let's have a discussion about that." But she was young, and she admits that she wasn't, she just didn't know how to cope with that kind of a conversation. So like so many of us do when somebody brings up death and dying, "Oh, don't talk like that. You'll be fine. Don't talk like that." So that conversation ended abruptly when my mother said, "No, don't talk about that." What would he have said? Who knows? Would he have apologised for the wrongs? What kind of a conversation would they have had? So I think that would have played on my mother's mind, and she openly admits that it was a missed opportunity, and she wishes she'd opened that door. But as a result, she was looking further into death and dying.
You have a quote on your website, and it says, an American anthropologist once said, "When a person is born, we rejoice. When they're married, we jubilate. But when they die, we try to pretend nothing has happened."
Isn't that true? And it's the same. Imagine getting married. Or the amount of preparation and the wedding plan. You hire a wedding planner and you take 8 months to plan this wedding to great expense. And that's a huge celebration. However, there's this other phase of life called dying, and we spend 2 hours with a funeral director trying to work out what this person wanted. So yeah, it just seems quite odd. These are great events that most of us will face. Well, let's face it, all of us will face the latter one. Why don't we give it a little bit more thought and preparation?
I have found with both of my parents dying that you're right, that you can put on this huge event in the same time that you put on a wedding, and that it all happens so quickly, and you make so many decisions. I wanted to talk to you about this sort of saga, and it was the coffin swapping saga in Rockhampton a few years ago. Can you tell me about that and the listeners?
Over the years, there have been many reports of dodgy funeral behaviour and dodgy funeral director behaviour. And it's time that we informed ourselves and knew what questions to ask and what to look for. So how it was in Rockhampton was simply they didn't get what they paid for. They thought that, and in fact, my mother said the same thing about her father, that they paid for a nice coffin. But my mother remembers looking at the coffin at the funeral while the priest was doing his thing, and she was looking at going, that crack was not in that coffin when we bought it. So yes. And the funeral industry is unregulated, rightly or wrongly. Even still. So if you wanted to start organising funerals tomorrow, you could, just with a phone or a briefcase. You don't need to prove to anyone that you have any qualifications or anything. It's there's very much two camps within the funeral industry themselves. A lot of funeral directors are screaming out for regulation, whereas others go, nope, we don't want a bar of regulation. So it's, I hear in this role, lots of stories of families who've been very disappointed by the actions of funeral directors. And I'll give you one example within southern Queensland of a lady who was terminal, and as part of her grieving process and her acceptance process was she went out and she organised the coffin. So she bought the coffin and started decorating her own coffin. So when people came around to the house, to the barn, she would take them into the barn and show them the coffin, and they would have great conversations about this coffin and how she was feeling and how they were feeling. And when it came time, she died, and her elderly husband went to the funeral director, we've got the coffin, and the funeral director flat out refused to accept that coffin. And that coffin was instrumental to the grieving process and the communication process of the death, after that death. And for a funeral director to say, no, you've got to use one of ours, makes me see red. Awful. And some funeral directors will say, oh, no, it has to be ours because, there are legal requirements. We need to make sure it's safe. And that's BS. There are no official requirements within Australia, like Australian standard, as they will quote. It needs to be sturdy. There's a few rules, but there's no reason that a coffin sourced elsewhere cannot be used. And if a funeral director tells you otherwise, they're not the funeral director for you, which is a big reason why I wrote the bottom drawer book. I want people to be informed. So if a funeral director says, no, you can't have that, you've got to do it this way, you can push back and go, no, mate, that's not how it is.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect opener because I want to talk to you about the bottom drawer book. I think this is your second book. You'd written a book before that, was it?
No, this is the first book.
This is your first one?
Yeah,
so
first
tell us
one,
all
but
about
it's
it.
the
What is
fourth
it?
edition.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the bottom drawer book is an after-death action plan because when you die, somebody's going to have to make an awful lot of decisions in a short amount of time, and they're not going to be thinking clearly. They're going to be very sad. They're going to be griefy and confused. They're going to be juggling lots of things. Most of all, how you want to be farewelled. So unless you've had that conversation, which some people have, the bottom drawer book contains lots of information so you can make informed decisions about your end-of-life choices, like whether you want a coffin, a cheap coffin or an expensive casket, whether you want to be buried wearing a bra or shoes. It's a big thing. If someone buries me in heels, I'm going to come back and haunt them.
Oh.
Like, there's no way. Don't put me in heels for eternity. No. Things like natural burial options. There are other options, which is something we didn't discuss in the Toowoomba Cemetery, but the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery are looking at a natural burial ground. So you would be buried at a shallower depth, wearing natural fibres. So you would break down into the ground and become essential nutrients for that environment far quicker than you would in a big heavy casket 4 feet down. So there's all this kind of alternatives or options for you to think about, but people just don't know about it. So I started, 12, 13, 14 years ago, I started researching this because I'm a bit of an organisational freak. I wanted to make sure that people knew what I wanted, but I couldn't find out the information for me to make informed decisions. So the thing I love about funeral directors is they'll answer your questions, probably because they think you're a client, about to become a client. But also I found them so open. So we had wonderful discussions, cold calling funeral directors all over the country saying, what can I put in my coffin? What can't I put in my coffin?
Well, talk to me about that because I read that you can't put a bottle of alcohol in the coffin.
Well, it depends if you're going to be buried or cremated.
Right.
Anything flammable can't go into, the furnace because boom. Things like
that's going out with a bang, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or a pacemaker that has a battery. Batteries tend to explode, and you don't want to ruin the furnace because they're worth a mozza. So they would have to be removed if you are being cremated. The most popular things, family photos are put into the casket. Blankets, home-sewn blankets.
Wow.
Those little trinkets are quite common, as well as cigarettes, booze. Every now and again you hear of a phone or a torch.
Yes.
And there as well.
The people who are men are mostly buried in suits, is that right? And women, this is if they're I suppose if they're cremated or buried, and women often in their favourite dress, but sometimes in nighties.
It's whatever is most comfortable to you, because we've got to think practically. And yes, traditional ways of doing death, you would be well dressed. But it's like, no, mate, put me in my tracky dacks, and I'll be happy without heels. I'll be fine. So yeah, 90s are popular. There's those guys who retire, but once they've retired, they still keep working. They still keep wearing their high-vis. They still keep working, wearing their old uniforms. It makes sense that, he would be buried in that uniform. Yeah. But when we're talking about burying people in suits, it's so impractical to attempt to put a person who is dead in a suit. It's just pretty difficult.
Because they're as heavy as lead, aren't they?
Absolutely. Well, a lead weight, or dead weight.
Yeah.
So, if you've got to be practical about this, have a think. What do you want to be buried in? You know, do you want to be buried in a bra? And it's
Just a bra or
well,
a sequence bra, perhaps?
it's up to you. See, this is the thing. The world is your oyster. You can do it however you want, but it's not uncommon for the metal from underwire bras to be collected after the cremation. So you might have a titanium hip or a knee or something, so those joints don't burn during the cremation. So little bits of wire, fillings, all that kind of stuff is left behind. So it's not uncommon that your underwire will be fished out as well.
Well, I read that, and then I read that they're often melting that stuff back down and recycling it. Is that true?
Yes, there's a company, an international company called Ortho Metals, who comes along and they pick up all the bits. And it's worth big money. And Ortho Metals, I think they're based in the Netherlands, they will pick up tons and tons and tons every year, and it goes to be recycled. And it's just fascinating that there's so much left over, so to speak. But it's great that it's been utilised, and more often than not, they will pay for that recycled material to take it away because it's valuable to them, to charities. So the crematorium will have a couple of charities lined up. So your false knee, the income from that will go to a local charity.
Well, look, I think, your book, it covers all of these things. I know with my own parents, going and looking at the caskets and, these handles were worth, I can't even remember, like a lot of money. And this handle wasn't as expensive. And then you're feeling guilty because you're not going for the most expensive one. And my mother, we tried to get her to speak about what sort of funeral she wanted. She said, no, I don't care what you do because funerals are only for the living and not for the dead. And I was kind of resentful about that because I thought, we don't know what you want, Mum. And I think your book is showing us all those options. What about to be embalmed or not to be embalmed?
I'm a big anti-embalmer.
Are you?
Embalming is a very invasive procedure.
What does it mean
Embalming
exactly?
means preservation. And there are different levels of chemicals. So in America, embalming is the done thing. So what they do, they virtually remove all your fluids and replace them with preservatives, with other chemicals. And it comes down to the bacteria, the microbes, they don't like the taste of the chemicals they're putting in, so they'll leave you alone. However, to do that, I won't go into the details, but when we talk about respecting the dead, you don't really want to know that all your blood and everything is being pushed out of your body and being replaced by a chemical. So that's embalming. So it is not a requirement within Australia unless you are being buried above ground. And yes, it's the term called buried above ground. If you're in a mausoleum or a crypt, you will have to be in a heavy duty sealed casket. So there's no leakage. To be frank, and you would have to be embalmed as well. So, but to be buried in the ground or cremated, absolutely not. You do not have to be embalmed. It can cost, up to just over $1,000 to be embalmed. So save that money.
Yeah. Do people mostly do that if they're having an open casket? Do they?
Sometimes, and again, it comes down to, and this is why it's got its own page in the book. We have this thing where we don't want our loved ones to look dead. We want them to look sleeping. So we have to ask ourselves, where's the line? They're dead, so why can't we see them as dead? And this is a societal thing that we in recent decades are very bad at. We used to look after our own dead. Just 100 years ago, they would be laid out in our own rooms. The front
room.
That's
in the
right.
good room.
Yep, in the good room. People would come and sit and say their goodbyes and mourn. And several days later, or a couple of days later, they would end up at the cemetery. But now we hand off our dead to people we don't know, men in suits in the middle of the night. So as for whether an open casket, obviously the body changes upon death, and sometimes it changes pretty quickly depending on the mode of death and the chemicals that were in the body at the time, for example, chemo. So if you're okay with your loved one looking dead, great, but there's lots of interventions that are done which might not be palatable if you hear about it. And I can go more into those, but it's up to you. I'll put this back on you. How, do you want me to talk about eye caps and stitching them out?
A
for
little bit,
example?
I think. Why not? Yeah.
So when someone dies, all the muscles relax, and the eyes kind of sink in. The eyes dry out, and they sink down a little bit. So to plump them back up and to give the face some shape, these little plastic things with a kind of like a serrated edge on the top go over your eyes. It's like a big plastic contact lens, and then the eyelid is pulled over it, and the little barbs catch the eyelid, so it stays shut. So it's A, it's work to close the eyes, and B, it's work to give the eyes some shape. And it's the same with the mouth. When somebody dies, everything kind of relaxes. The mouth is the first, you fall asleep
When
to your
you're
mate on the
asleep.
plane and they're, mouth's wide open, snoring away. Well, it's the same thing. It's often the same thing when people die, that their mouth opens, but that might not be palatable if somebody is going to view them. So that mouth has to be closed. So there are tips of the trade. There's things called mouth formers, which again gives the mouth the shape that you would expect, that you're familiar with. And there are also some techniques to close that mouth that can be seen as
fascinating.
invasive. Yeah.
Now, you are not organising a sexpo, are you? You're organising a death expo. Tell me about the death expo that you're organising.
In October, there's an amazing group of people that have somehow come together here in Toowoomba. All sorts of people who are working in the industry, whether they be in aged care, health, grief support, palliative care, financial planning, nursing, paramedicine, all these people in the deaf biz have decided to demystify death and dying, and that is the theme of the inaugural Death Expo 2025 to be held in Toowoomba on October 11. And it's going to be huge. Like there are some amazing speakers. We've got a comedian, a palliative care nurse whose specialty is helping people die at home. Her name is Carolyn Mandersloot, and she's a nurse out at Charleville and a clinical support worker out there, and she's a comedian. So she'll be there. The amazing Jean Kitson, remember her from the Big Gig days, and comedian, like fangirling heaps because I watched her growing up as a comedian, but she had some terrible experiences when her parents died accessing palliative care. So now she's become a spokesperson for not only nurses, palliative care nurses, but also she likes talking about the process and how awful her process is. So what can we do to fix it? So Jean Kitson is the keynote speaker.
Wow.
At this expo that we're offering for free, thanks to some generous sponsors. Yeah.
So it's in October. Okay, well, we're going to watch out for that. So you've become somewhat of a death expert, really, haven't you? Just tell me about the Wollston Park inquiry that you've been appearing at in the last 10 days or so.
This is wild. So in 2018, I was wandering around the Goodness Cemetery down the range in Ipswich, and there was a plaque there paying homage to the remains of patients of Wollston Park Mental Hospital, where the location is unknown of their resting place. And I kind of looked at this plaque and went, how can you not know? How do you lose these patients? So I went down a rabbit warren.
Another one.
There's lots of. You should see my yard. With some research, I worked out that several thousand patients had been exhumed from the cemetery at the Wollston Park Mental Hospital at Wacol, and supposedly exhumed and moved to the Goodness Cemetery, but there are no records.
How did you find that out?
I went through Hansard, so the parliamentary inquiries. So when politicians spruiked about the good work they were doing in the 1940s, they spoke about the closure of the cemetery because they needed to build more wars for the shell-shocked soldiers coming back from World War II, and the cemetery was going to be right next to the wards. So they thought it was a pretty bad look for these poor soldiers coming home to viewing the cemetery, so they wanted to move the cemetery. So I went through Trove, a lot of newspaper articles, a lot of interviews, and it was well documented in the media that that several thousand had been exhumed. And I wrote a blog about this, and you can find the blog on the bottom drawer book page, .com.au. I had somebody come forward and say to me, I was a 17-year-old carpenter in the late 1940s, and it was my job to make ossuaries, which are small shoebox size boxes. So once they exhumed the body, they exhumed the remains, they dug down through the cemetery, through the coffin lid. They just broke the cemetery, they broke the coffin lid, scooped out the remains, put them in these shoebox things. And he said he made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these as a 17, 18, 19-year-old carpenter apprentice at the Wollston Park Hospital. But he said they didn't exhume them all from those cemeteries. There was a time limit of the remains that would be moved. So he's adamant there are still bodies or still the remains of patients on the original cemetery sites, which is now kind of owned by Queensland Police. He also remembers going to the Goodness Cemetery itself and seeing trenches dug and those ossuaries placed end to end in those trenches. But again, the Goodner Trust has no records of this, and nor does anybody. So it's just an oral history by a man who was very with it. I drove out to Roma to interview him, and he was very, very with it. And his memories were very, very clear. I checked his memories on aerial photographs at the time, and everything he said was accurate. So that's as closest as anyone has come to finding those remains. So at the moment, the state government has an inquiry into the treatment of the patients of that mental hospital between 1950 and 2000. And for the last few months, they have welcomed and encouraged people with any experiences of that hospital to get in touch, because over the decades, there have been many, many complaints and abuses alleged, sexual abuse, rape, chemical restraint. Some awful stories have come out of Wollston Park Mental Hospital. So there's an inquiry into this. But as part of this inquiry, lots of people have also got in touch with the review and said, I wasn't a patient, but my great-grandmother was, and we can't find out where she is. So it's really important we explore where the remains of the patients are. And a significant amount of people have got in touch with the review, so much so that the state government is serious about doing something about where these remains are. And I'm the only one who's ever looked into it.
Wow.
Extraordinary.
Yes,
so
extraordinary, great work.
So I got to
Lisa.
face the review and tell my story just a couple of weeks ago, and it's fantastic that it's going to be put on the public record. My findings will be put on the public record.
Yeah, really significant work. Now, I haven't got to talk to you about Frank Sinatra and his death. I haven't got to talk to you about the Pope and his plain casket, which I loved, nor you doing the Larapinta Trail, or the ashes in space, which some people like to be, and going up in fireworks. But what I am at the part of the interview where I like to ask someone who's their favourite royal. You'll have to make it quick for me. Is it a dead one or an alive one?
It's a dead one. It's Diana. It's Princess Diana, of course, mainly because when I was a teenager, she was the one we all aspired to because, she was the princess and I was a teenager, so Princess Diana. Incidentally, still on the topic of death, she was buried without any jewellery. But when you go back to Queen Victoria, she was buried with rings on every finger, layered in bracelets and layered necklaces as well. So she was all glammed up when she was buried, but Diana, not so much.
But I suppose, I was thinking about that before when you're talking about people being cremated with jewellery. What happens to that and who collects that? Is that given back to the family?
It depends what's left. Yeah. And there's not much left. It's all melted down. And,
okay,
yeah.
Right. And then the song that can't keep you off the dance floor.
Diana Ross, Chain Reaction. I'm such an 80s girl. Anything from the 80s, I'm there.
It's great. Well, look, as I said, I didn't think we were going to have enough time. We haven't. We might have to come back for version 3. Where can someone get your book from?
Yeah, online, thebottomdrawerbook.com.au. And if you enjoy reading about all things death and dying on a myriad of topics, just click the blog tab on thebottomdrawerbook.com.au. I'm also on Facebook, The Bottom Drawer Book.
Okay, we can watch out for that. And there's all things in there that you would never even think of, not just what song you want played at your funeral, but all of that. Do you want a bra? Do you not want a bra?
And also just things like write down some of your life's reflections. The amount of emails I get and say, thanks so much for the book. Half the eulogy was written because it's what she wrote. She listed the most outrageous things that she had done and how she describes herself. Those things that you're proud of. Those kind of things are really important to capture in your handwriting too.
Well, Lisa, it's been absolutely fascinating. I think if you've got some time, I think you need to do one of your tours and also get the Bottom Drawer book. That's been wonderful. Thank you for being my guest on Big Little Small Talk.
Thank you for talking death for an hour.
That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.
You've been listening to a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast. For more podcasts or to listen to live and local Toowoomba radio, please visit 1027.com.au or download the Community Radio Plus app.